There was a lot of noise that night, which irritated Ritu in ways she had never thought possible.
As much as I want to shut the mouth of my snoring husband, I want to feel him, to feel wanted.
All Prescient did was work and sleep.
It's like living with a robot, which would still be better because some robots are sex toys, and I would choose them repeatedly over the man beside me.
Soft sounds filled her ears and she groaned in frustration.
Being sex-deprived is terrible, but having to listen to a never-tired duo have their love fight every night is worse. This has been the case since Kapil moved in after marrying Sakshi.
Sakshi's next moan was more like a cry. Ritu knew it was not a cry for help, but one she couldn't relate to, one she yearned to feel. She pressed her face deep into the pillow until she couldn't take it anymore.
I need a trim, but more badly, I need someone inside me doing the same thing Kapil does to the girl in the next room.
Taking off her blue nightrobe, she leaned closer to her husband and kissed his hairy chest. She felt him shift as her breasts grazed his skin and his eyes flashed open as she rubbed her hands on his body.
What are you doing?
His eyes had a startling gaze and he looked very unpleased.
Make love to me.
She whispered, positioning herself so he could fully view everything he wanted. However, he wanted it. He sighed, and her anticipation was reduced to nothing, just like the previous night and the night before.
How often do I have to tell you how exhausted I get after work? Of course, you'll never understand. But I don't have any more energy to explain it to you repeatedly.
His tone had moved to a slightly annoyed one, but that was the least of Ritu's problems.
I was angry. He would have noticed if his eyes weren't so clouded with sleep.
As she reclined to bed, his hands came across her.
Weekend, and I'm all yours, I promise.
He did make empty promises regarding her sexual demands, so she wasn't thrilled. Money was the only guarantee that kept her where she was involved. She always thought that was enough. Kapil changed that. In no time he was snoring again, this time louder than before. Ritu got up from bed in annoyance and left the room. She went to the living room and settled into a chair, but she regretted that decision as she closed her eyes and tried to force herself to sleep. She could hear Kapil and Sakshi clearer than from her room, and her body froze.
Whatever task he is carrying out on her, he is an expert on it. They spend hours at it every night, and I so much envy Sakshi. She gazed at their bedroom door and was amazed to find it slightly open. There was just a little space, and Ritu found her eyes stuck on it. Slowly, she got up and moved stealthily towards the door, and even though every part of her told her she should leave, her feet were glued to the ground. It wasn't so bright inside the room. The dim lights were the only ones up, but she could make out everything happening. It was clear from her position that she couldn't be seen when they were both drunk in sex, so she leaned in and looked. Sakshi was underneath her husband, her head buried deep in the sheets, and her hands gripped the headboard so tight that Ritu was convinced it would leave marks. Kapil was on his knees above her, taking her violently from behind while both his hands cupped her breasts, his fingers tugging at her nipples. Ritu repeatedly swallowed at the sight in front of her, and she could feel her legs tremble. She leaned into the wall to maintain her balance. Sakshi was calling his name repeatedly, but he didn't stop. His pace never slowed. He was focused on her, pleading with his woman, and he did so until she came in a great release. Ritu watched Sakshi's fingers slowly slide down the wooden bed frame and onto the bed, while Kapil intensified his ride until he crashed beside her seconds later. They were both breathing very hard, and he turned her over and kissed her. It was the most extended kiss Ritu had ever experienced. Sakshi was tired at first, but she later picked up with him. He soon withdrew, and Ritu thought it was over until she saw his head bend as he took Sakshi's nipple into his mouth. Ritu decided she had seen enough and backed away. She could feel the moisture between her legs as she returned to the room and her sleeping husband. In no time, the moans resumed, and Ritu cursed into the night. It was going to be a long one. There was something about being an Indian woman that I always looked out for. I had spent my teenage years learning all about a man's needs and how to satisfy them. Aside from the gossip and informal pieces of training, I had gone the extra mile, reading erotic books and watching videos on the internet, and I could swear in any temple that I was an expert. I always wanted to be the perfect wife, always wanted my husband never to leave me for another woman, and I had worked hard to get there only to get rewarded with a husband who saw the world very differently from how I did. Disappointed is not enough word to describe how I felt. I almost didn't believe this was the life I was living, but I had learned to put up with it. Although my sex life was a joke, getting married to Dr. Prashant, the Minister of Health, did bring me everything I needed. The money, the jewelry, the reputation, the power, and the comfort. At some point, I was okay living that way, but when my stepdaughter got married, I knew I needed more. 32 and hot, I could make any man fall. My beauty was wild. I was the center of attention in any room I entered, and I had a dress sense that appreciated every inch of my sexy frame. I wore long hair, and people gaped whenever it swept my sari blouse as I walked. Of course, Sakshi was a strong enough competition too. She was dashing and had the perfect curves men found appealing, but there was no measuring up to me. It then made me wonder why I was jealous of the girl who was supposedly my daughter. I soon found my answer, and it was the handsome brown-haired Kapil who worked as a bank manager and was a satisfying husband. I had to give him a plus. A woman's moan said a lot about her man, and those of Sakshi's were real and made my skin shiver every time they rang across the house. I knew I was losing my patience with my husband, and if he didn't get his act together, I knew I would be looking for the same services elsewhere in no time. She cast side glances at Sakshi as she stirred the soup in the pot repeatedly. "Is there any problem, Mom?" Fakes a smile. "All good, how was work?" Drops the vegetables she was chopping and turns to Ritu. "You're not going to believe this. Xavier discovered duplicate transactions made from many receipts. There's a thief in my company, and I do not know how to start an investigation." Scoffing. "Well, you better figure something out before you get completely robbed." I know, it's just...
Her phone began buzzing and she moved to pick it up but turned away when she saw the caller.
"We're going through a lot of reformation at the moment, and I wasn't expecting anything of the sort." Yeah, I guess most expectations are just that. Expectations.
She smiled and looked up at Sakshi when her phone rang again.
"Aren't you going to pick that up?" No, it's nothing, just work."
She dragged the work so long as it was buying time to think of her following statement.
I wanted to take a break from that and just focus on family, for real.
Kapil was soon home, and while Sakshi set the table, Ritu picked up her phone and called Prashant, informing him his dinner was ready and how long it would take him to be home.
Sighs.
She dropped the phone and moved to the table to join Sakshi in dressing.
"Dad's not coming home?" Nodding in the most boring tone. "Something about work and an operation." Clicks her tongue. "He's so hardworking, always out there saving lives. I think of him as a hero."
Ritu stared at her, and for a brief moment she wanted to put her fist through her, because what kind of man cared more about strangers than the lady in his bed every night? But instead, she maintained a calm countenance and said,
"Yeah, he is amazing."
She noticed the happy flow of conversation between the couple, who sat with her during dinner, and Ritu held back tears. Theirs was real love, and she hadn't experienced that in her entire life. He occasionally rubbed Sakshi's arms while they laughed and sometimes whispered words into her ears. They talked about work, the latest news and gossip, and finally parted ways for the night. Kapil and Sakshi went to their room for a beautiful night, and she went to her listening game that night with no snoring husband by her side.